welcome to our What's Next podcast, starting on the book of Revelation. We are so excited about this 7-week journey that we're going to be taking. We're starting off today basically because over the last year, with the pandemic going on, it's hard to believe lockdown is 1 year as of like 3 weeks from now.
It's crazy.
So we're coming to a year anniversary on this lockdown, and people have asked the question, are we in the end times? And there's been a lot of people wanting to talk about the book of Revelation. And so we did this message 4 weeks ago on are we in the end times? And it just spurred more questions. A lot of people had questions. And so we said, let's do this. We've been talking about it for a long time.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
Like throwing in 2020, the U.S. election and Donald Trump, and it just all the hype and all the things that are going on. It's like, are we in the end times? Like, did the book of Revelation predict this? Like, what's going on? So
is the world coming to an end?
Exactly.
And so we thought, okay, let's start off. We're going to do 7 weeks. And I know some people have already said, that's not enough time. Yeah, we know, but we have other things we have to do too. But it leads up to Easter. And that's why we wanted to do it now. This is a great conversation when we talk about Easter. Because when we talk about Christmas, we talk about Advent, we talk about the expectation of Christ coming as the child. But Revelation and Easter have a lot of expectation in themselves as well around the death, the resurrection, and Christ's return.
Yeah, for sure.
So a second Advent is what it's often called. And Revelation is all really about the second Advent. And so that's what we're going to be chatting about. So it's really preparation for us for Easter and getting ready. And we did 7 because 7 is like the perfect number. If you don't know what we're talking about, come back next podcast for our symbolism one.
Exactly.
So just a little teaser in there.
So this series is going to be perfect.
It's perfect. Absolutely. Because Daniel and I know everything about Revelation.
Not really. Not really. And so that's kind of how we wanted to start today, is just to acknowledge that we're coming at this as students. We're coming at this as people who want to learn. Obviously we're going to give our take and we're going to give our current understanding, but we just want to recognize that like we don't have a complete handle on the book of Revelation. Really, anyone who says that they completely understand everything that's in the book and they have the corner on truth and the proper interpretation, like you should view them with a healthy level of skepticism, because no one has a complete handle on the book of Revelation.
Yeah, I mean, there is a really good chance that Daniel and I are going to disagree on some stuff.
Yeah.
There's a good chance that you're going to disagree with us on some stuff. And just the nature of studying the book of Revelation, there's a good chance that by the end of this, we're going to disagree with ourselves on some stuff.
Yeah, we might like 1 week go with this interpretation and the next week we get convinced of another, but that's what it's about. It's about wrestling with the text and trying to let it be the authority, not our ideas or how we were raised or the traditions that we were brought up in.
Yeah, and we're really excited. We have been working on getting some guests to join us in the podcast ahead. We do have one confirmed, but we're going to kind of surprise them, tease them out as we come along. But they are experts in these fields. They are going to offer some great contributions to the conversation. So we're really excited about that. And so as we head into this, we want to really keep in mind what the primary focus is, what is most important. And that's that this is about the church expecting Jesus in our lives currently and the expectation of Christ's return. It's twofold. It's not simply Christ's return at the end, but the book is a call to expect Christ to show up in our lives through the Holy Spirit even now. And so that is a huge part of what we're going to be talking about in this podcast.
And I will just say, if you're listening to this, because up to this point, we've only ever done audio only podcasts, but this is our first ever podcast that we're doing that has video. And so this is going to be uploaded to platforms that have video. So if you're listening to this and you actually want to watch it, head on over to our YouTube channel. Just look up Hillside Wesleyan Church on YouTube and you'll be able to watch us as we're talking about this. You can see we got our coffee here all ready to go. It is about 2:00 in the afternoon. So we're needing some coffee right now, but we have a lot of fun things to talk about. So it's going to be a good time.
So yeah, let's jump into this. A good part about understanding the book of Revelation, an important part, is understanding the genre.
Yeah.
Like if you watch movies, you watch Netflix. I mean, we've been in a pandemic. Who hasn't watched movies and Netflix? There are different genres, right? Like there's dramas, there's thrillers, there's comedies, there's dramedies, right? Drama and comedy. I think that's a good one to keep in mind as we talk about this book here in a moment. But there are different genres. And even in writings in our culture today, there are different types of writings, right? We have mystery books, we have romance novels, you have history books, you have historical fiction, and
you have like news reports. That's a different kind of genre.
Absolutely. And so when we're talking about the book of Revelation, to just assume that it's just a book, it doesn't fit within a genre, is very misleading, because it actually fits within a very particular and common genre from its time period. Yeah,
and the genre is just super important because every genre has certain expectations and norms around how you interpret what's in that genre. And so this is going to become really important once we get into Revelation, is how are we supposed to interpret the things that we're reading. And so one example, the Super Bowl happened a few weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And if you read somewhere that the Buccaneers slaughtered the Chiefs last night, depending on the context in which you heard that, or the genre of the medium that was used to communicate that message to you, you could interpret that very different ways. If you read that in an ancient document that was some historical text, you would interpret it one way. You might interpret it as like literal Buccaneers were like literally going after like the chiefs of some village, and there was some sort of genocide that happened.
Right.
Versus if you knew that it was the Super Bowl, so coming from like a 20th century, 21st century American perspective, and you read that in the newspaper in the sports section, which has its own genre and its own meaning for words, you would immediately understand that it's just talking about the names of the football teams that are really particular to this time and place in history. And so that's just one of many examples of how genre really, really affects how we need to interpret texts.
Yeah, and so what is the genre of the book of Revelation?
Yeah, that's the question.
So one thing, there's actually two parts of it. It very much is like a dramedy, except it's not drama and comedy. It's more tragedy in some ways. But Apocalypse itself, we talked about being apocalyptic literature. And something that we have to be careful of actually when we're talking about this is that a lot of the terms that we use come from ancient Greek, ancient Latin, languages that no longer exist. And you say, well, I know people who speak Greek. Well, ancient Greek is a little bit different than modern day Greek. They're not the same. And Latin, like, you might be old enough, you were taught Latin at school, but it's really a dead language. Nobody speaks Latin.
Even though we still know how to read it and understand it, no one just natively speaks it.
Right. And that changes our understanding of the text. And so a lot of words that we're going to use when we look at the book of Revelation are words that, as they've been adopted into the English language, their meaning has shifted a little bit. And so we're going to try to help unpack that a little bit. And so one of those very first words is apocalypse.
Yeah.
Because in English, apocalypse has really much come to be this idea of it's the end of the world, right? That's in our mind, that's exactly what it means. It means the end. But apocalypse in ancient Greek just meant revelation, to reveal something, to help somebody understand something, to have something unveiled, to be able to grasp it, to understand it, to comprehend it. Mm-hmm. And so this is really important, because when we talk about apocalyptic literature, when we talk about this as the genre of apocalypse, it does have a feeling of the end of the world, but it's really about the unveiling, the revealing of truth. That's what the book is really about, the revealing of truth, which is hard to get because there's so much symbolism in it that it's hard to understand what it's talking about. But the word apocalypse itself is just unveiling, revealing the truth. And so the first two words of this book is literally the apocalypse or the unveiling or the revelation, right? Revealing, revelation. That's why we call it the book of Revelation. That's literally the first two words, the revelation, the apocalypse. So when we read this and when we look at the text from that genre, it changes the meaning from not just being end times, taking the English understanding of the word, to actually its older, more important role, which is the unveiling of truth, the unveiling of God's desire. And so Jesus talks about this in Matthew chapter 11, verse 27. He says, "My Father has entrusted everything to me. No one truly knows the Son except the Father, and no one truly knows the Father except the Son, and those to whom the Son chooses to reveal him." And so this is what we're seeing, is that the revelation is an unveiling by the Son of the Father's plans so that people may know the truth.
Yeah.
And so that's what apocalyptic literature is.
Yeah. And it's really important, I think, where when we think about apocalypse, we automatically think of the apocalypse as something that's happening in the future. But this is bringing it much more into the present, and we'll get into this a little bit more. But this really starts to affect how we understand the relationship of the apocalypse, of the unveiling, as to, is it trying to predict the future or is it trying to speak to the current situation? We're going to get into that later, so I don't want to jump ahead of ourselves, but just to know that in the ancient understanding of that Greek understanding of the apocalypse, apocalypsis, it's really just this unveiling. So, you know, if you think of a play, at the start of every play, there's an unveiling. There's something that you didn't know that was happening before. And then, it's an unveiling. It's an apocalypse at the start of every play. The curtains come off.
The curtains come off.
And so what we wanted to kind of do in this episode is we really want to focus on chapter 1 of the book of Revelation, because so much of chapter 1, it's going to just naturally bring up the conversations that we want to have around genre and around historical context and things that are just really important for kind of like an introduction to the book. And so I thought, why don't we just go ahead and start reading, and then we can kind of like stop along the way when we kind of want to focus in on something. So do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it?
No, go ahead.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah. So Pastor Daniel will be reading from the ESV.
Yep.
English Standard Version, which is a great version. I'm going to be using the New Living Translation because this is the translation that we as a church use on Sunday mornings for preaching. So it's what Hillsiders are comfortable with. And so it's not that any one translation is right or that we're favoring one over the other. That's actually what we're trying to show, is that we can work through the questions and work together on discovering the truth through a variety. There'll be some times when we actually pull up the Greek and work through that. Don't worry, we won't show you that whole process there. But we want to work on revealing the truth and understanding the question. So we're going to use a variety of translations as we go through this over the next 7 weeks.
Yeah, and so this is the ESV, Revelation chapter 1. And just in case anyone out there has called it the book of Revelations, it's actually just the book of Revelation. That's a really common misunderstanding. So just to clear the air, it's one revelation. It's not multiple revelations.
It's singular, yeah.
Yeah. Even though there's multiple visions. So, you could argue there's multiple kind of revelations. But anyway, we'll get into that in the future. There's so many questions about this book. It is a crazy, awesome, and weird book all at the same time. All right, so chapter 1, verse 1. The revelation, then again, that's that word apocalypse that we just talked about. The revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave him to show his servants what must happen very soon. He made it clear by sending his angel to his servant John, who then testified to everything that he saw concerning the word of God and the testimony about Jesus Christ. And so why don't we just stop there and just kind of think about what we just read. And so there's John is writing this, and he's basically saying that what is happening is that Jesus is going to give him a revelation. Jesus is going to pull back the curtain and show him what is actually happening. And he's going to do this by way of sending an angel to John. And so let's talk a little bit maybe about who this John is, because if you're just reading this, you have no idea who John is.
Yeah, and so the church has actually debated over a number of years who John is. There is John the Apostle, which I'm going to give you my bias right now. I think it's John the Apostle, and I'll kind of build my case for that here very shortly. There is John the Elder, who was a church statesman. Both John the Apostle and John the Elder were in the church in Ephesus. There are two graves there for Johns from the same time. One is the Apostle, one is this other John that some think was an elderman who might have written this. Some think John the Baptist. The problem with it being John the Baptist is John the Baptist passed away before Jesus Christ was really remanded into custody, crucified, resurrected. So a lot of this wouldn't make sense for John the Baptist to record. There's too much interplay and connection between the Gospels that John the Baptist would have no reference to. Some say there's just some other random person named John. Maybe.
Maybe, probably not.
Maybe, probably not. Some think the guy named Cerinthus was a prominent Gnostic, which is something we're going to talk about, I think, next week as we get into symbolism. But Cerinthus was a common Gnostic, and John actually wrote the Gospel of John to combat Cerinthus, to actually fight against the Gnostic principles. Some see some of those Gnostic things trying to slip into Revelation, but really I think John is just trying to unveil how Gnosticism is wrong, how there is both a dualistic nature of the material world and the spiritual world coming together in the God who created both, whereas Gnosticism says that the material world is completely evil. And so Jesus, everything that is good is only spiritual. So that's a big part of this and why I don't think it's Cerinthus, because this does hold that there are elements of creation that are good. And when we get to the end, the creation of the new heaven and the new earth. If material things were bad, there would be no creation of a new earth.
Yep.
There is some who believe that the Apostle John was a pseudonym, that somebody had taken on the apostle's name. There is some credibility to that in that it was semi-common in the old days to do that in the ancient times, but it wasn't very often that people did that. And typically if somebody were to do that, they would have been much more explicit. They would have said, this is the Apostle John and I'm writing you. They wouldn't have left it as ambiguous as this writing is. So that's kind of a tick against it. Plus, when you read the text, the way John refers to love here lines up very well with how he talks about love in the Gospel of John and in his 3 letters. So I think that's a big mark for the Apostle John having written this. So it really comes down to 2 strong contenders for it, John the Apostle or John the Elder.
Yep.
Church history says it's probably the Apostle John. I tend to lean that way. But what's interesting is that whether you believe it's the Apostle John or John the Elder, both of them were elder statements in the church of Ephesus, which is one of the churches that the John wrote the letter to. And as prominent Christian men in the church, it really at that point doesn't matter if it was John the Apostle or John the Elder. They were both writing from a position of authority to the church. But I do lean towards John the Apostle just because of how the language around love lines up so keenly between John the Gospel, John the Epistles, and how the epistles are written in this book, which we're going to get to in a little bit, and a lot in week 3. So I really lean towards John the Apostle, but I know there's some other interpretations out there, and I'm okay with that because I know I'm right. So
Mike's cracked the code. He's figured it out. So we know that there's at least someone called John, and he's the person who's seeing the vision. And this is really important. So he sees something, and then he testifies to what he has seen, and he's supposed to give it because this message is for the servants of Jesus Christ. So it's kind of coming from Jesus through an angel to John, and then John is meant to give this vision, these visions that he's had. He's meant to communicate this and testify to what he has seen. And so it's really important when we're talking about apocalypse, it's that unveiling. It is a very visual experience, and you can really kind of get that as you're reading about the visions. They're like really, it's one of those things where you're like, I can tell that he's trying to communicate what he saw, but as they say, like a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so sometimes you're like, there's so many different ways that I could imagine this. Like, I wonder what he actually saw. It would be really cool if he just had like a DVD version of
or
what
if
he
he
saw.
would have just used 1,000 more words to explain it.
Exactly. Words were expensive back then. Another thing I think it's important to point out when we talk about authorship is I think with a lot of times we think of authorship today, how people write books, and we kind of fail to take into account how books are written back in this time period. And so like the Apostle John wasn't an educated person. He probably didn't even know how to like write in Greek. He would have been a natural born Aramaic speaker. And so even like with the Gospel of John or with Revelation, a lot of people will talk about how John is kind of like the originator of the source material. So he's the one who is like giving the content, but then it has to go through a whole process of somebody else who actually is fluent in the language of Greek to like write down what he's saying. And so it gets really, really tricky when you start looking at the text and you're like, oh, well, in Revelation, he tends to, favor this verb or this word, whereas in the Gospel of John, he might favor this word. And people get like really intense about these arguments and disputes, but it's just important to remember that even if it was someone else writing it, what we're being told here is that the source material, like the visions were given to someone named John, and we think that person is most likely the apostle. And even if he was not the one to physically write them down, he was at least the one to tell them to somebody else, and then they would have written them down, or a community would have written them down. And so it's just important to kind of think about historically how people wrote letters and how people would have communicated written, because not everyone could write back then.
Yeah, and to that effect, they would have written this down once. We type it into a word processor, our computer, and then we can print out as many copies as we want.
Yep.
They wrote it down once. They would have sent the first letter. They would have sent it to the first church, and then the first church would have made a copy.
Yeah.
And then sent on the original to the next church and kept their copy. And then they didn't write it down again. What they would do is they would read it out loud to the church. Most people couldn't read. A lot of people couldn't read. So somebody would be designated to read the text to the church, to the churches. And so they would start copying it down by hand. There's no keyboards, no typewriters. It's all by hand.
No copy and paste.
No copy and paste. And so that would get written out and then shared with people that way. So it was a very labor-intensive process.
Yeah. So, all right, we're on verse 3. Here we go. So it says, "Blessed is the one who reads the words of this prophecy aloud." So even in the act of us reading this, according to the scripture, we are being blessed. The message is going to actually bless us. Since that's just an encouragement if you're listening, this is one of, I think it's the only book that actually says explicitly that if you read this book, you are blessed, which is just something that's really cool.
It's also the only one that says if you change this book, you are cursed.
Oh boy. No pressure.
No pressure.
Well, we're not going to change it. We might have different interpretations. We're not going to literally change what it says.
But
so
a good part of verse 3, though, is it talks about this as a prophecy.
Yeah.
And so that gets into what is the genre. Because
Exactly.
prophecy is another genre. It's different than apocalypse.
Yep.
It's different than apocalyptic literature. So this gets back to that idea of, is it a dramedy? Is it a comedy?
Is it a comma?
Is it a comma? I don't know.
Who knows?
It's a dramedy. It is apocalyptic literature, and it's prophecy. And actually, we're going to see in 2 weeks that a part of it's even an epistle, which we'll explain what an epistle is when we get to that. But this passage here says that some of this is prophetic. So the apocryphal part is the unveiling. It's the revealing of truth.
Yep.
The prophecy is a part that's about telling of what's going to happen, what's happening now, and what's going to happen in the future. And that has its own set of rules and guidelines.
Yeah. And a lot of times prophecy in the Old Testament doesn't necessarily have to be about the future. A lot of times it's like God speaking into the present situation. And oftentimes there is like a warning of judgment to come with prophecy. But if you think about the Old Testament prophets, usually they were like putting their finger on something specific that was going on in the culture and saying like, hey, this is not how God has called you to live, and you need to turn away, you need to repent, and you need to actually do what you said you're going to do, or this is going to happen. So one of the ways that people have distinguished between prophecy is just kind of that idea of like prophecy is like God speaking into what's happening. And apocalypse oftentimes has this idea that it deals with visions or revelations about the imminent coming of the end of the age. So this idea that something big is going to happen, and eventually God's final kingdom is going to like thwart the forces of evil once and for all. And obviously we see that in the book of Revelation, and there are glimmers of that all throughout the Old Testament prophecy. But specifically in some Old Testament passages, they border on potentially being considered apocalyptic literature because they deal with that. So things like Daniel or Zechariah, we've kind of talked about, have that kind of element of apocalyptic literature.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about Daniel and Zechariah and Old Testament imagery when we get to verse 7. But I think as we look at verse 3 here, and we look at the blessing that is upon us, because you called that out, and that's really important. Their blessings held a lot of value to our forefathers and foremothers, the forebearers. They meant something. You know, nowadays somebody sneezing, you can say, "God bless you." And people say, well, what God, right? Like,
yeah,
it doesn't hold much value in our society when people say bless you, as it used to. Back then, blessings were critical. Blessings were predominant. Blessings were going to come true in your life.
Yeah. All right, so let's continue with verse 3. And blessed are those who hear and obey. And again, that's that idea that the one who reads them, but also the one who actually hears this message and applies it. And I think this is important because it says, okay, I'll just finish reading, then I'll get to my point. Blessed are those who hear and obey the things that are written in it, because the time is near.
The time is near.
I think what is important about this verse is just that idea that this book had a relevant message that could be obeyed for the people who first heard it. And obviously that's really obvious when we get to like the letters to the specific churches, which we'll talk about in coming weeks. But even for the message of the visions in the more apocalyptic section, I think there's that aspect that this is actually a message that's speaking to the people, that there's something that they can hear and obey in this book. And so there is kind of this like applicability to their situation that we want to keep our interpretation grounded in.
Yeah, and so I think that comes to this really important conversation around the historical context of the book of Revelation. Who was it written for? We talked about who it was written by, right? We believe it's John the Apostle, but why did he write it? Beyond the angel saying, write this down because God told you
He's
to.
He's like, all right, I'll write it down.
But there was an intended audience.
Yeah.
God was telling John to write this down for a reason.
Exactly. And it gets to that in the next verse, right? In verse 4. So I'll just read that and then we can get to it. It says, from John, so there's that John we talked about, to the 7 churches that are in the province of Asia. And so right there, John is writing specifically to these 7 churches in the province of Asia. So who are they?
And so we are talking about these...
So yeah, the province of Asia is, you know, if you're thinking like, you know, the continent of Asia, really it's just modern day Turkey is the area that we're talking about. And so there's these 7 different churches that John is writing to, and so his message is directed towards them. But as Mike loves to point out, the number 7 is really significant in the book. And so anytime you see 7, there's probably some symbolic, significance to that number. Because in the Jewish worldview and the Jewish understanding of things, like 7 is the number of completion. Mm-hmm. And so you think about like when God created the heavens and the earth, how many days did it take him? Like it took him 6, but then, 7 is the complete. Like on the 7th day he rested because that was the day of completion. And again, all throughout the book of Revelation, we're going to see this number 7 coming up. There are 7 trumpets and 7 bowls and 7 seals, and there's 7 spirits and 7 churches. And so all of this is speaking to this language of fulfillment and completion. And so even though this is written to the 7 churches in the province Asia Minor, really that's also, I think, an intentional choice to symbolize that this is a message that is for like all people and all times and everyone who is a servant of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, you caught me there. I was on the wrong page in my notes.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to jump in.
Yeah, just do it. So, but a part of that, so when we talk about the completeness of the church, it's in Asia Minor. It's going to these 7 churches that are in what's now modern day Turkey.
Yeah.
But the church complete, it was the entire Roman world, which at that point it stretched as far south as Egypt and the whole northern coast of Africa. It went all the way to Spain, France, and England, and Wales on the west. The German border was the northern border. And then on the east was Judea and Samaria. So this is a massive area. And then the gospel itself, we have historical church history that tells us that it even went as far as into India and into China and Armenia. Actually, a lot of people think that Rome was the first Christian state, but it was actually Armenia, which was their northern neighbor. They were the first country to actually make Christianity its state religion. And so this message going out to Asia Minor was going out to the whole world, was going out to the whole known world at that time, to the whole church. But John was from Ephesus. His ministry was to Asia Minor, was to this area that's now Turkey. And so that's where he wrote to. That was his focus, was on these churches that he had helped plant and was a part of.
Yeah.
So that's where that comes to.
And so really this is also where we get that third genre of epistle, or it's a letter. Like he's writing to people. And so it's really kind of that combination of 3 different genres that are all kind of mixing and intermingling and, spilling over into each other. So that's part of what makes Revelation a really hard book to interpret.
Epistophacy. We got to put them all together.
Yeah.
And so John was actually writing from Patmos. This is really important to understand. He wasn't writing from the comfort of his home in Ephesus. He was writing from Patmos. He had been taken captive by the Roman government for lifting up Jesus Christ as the Lord, as the Savior, as the King of the world. And they weren't happy about that. At this point, they were into emperor worship. It was an imperial cult. This had actually started even when Jesus was alive. A lot of the terms that we see used for Jesus were actually direct comparisons to direct language that was being used for the emperor.
Like the word gospel, the euangelion, that was if an emperor was coming home from battle, they would send someone forward with the good news of that they had won a victory. And so that's just an example of that kind of imperial language that we find in the New Testament. Yeah,
and Son of God was actually a term that was used of the emperor to exalt them to divinehood.
Yeah.
And Jesus is saying, no, I am the true Son of God. And so because John was preaching this gospel news of Jesus Christ that stood in direct conflict with the emperor and his stated status, he exiled John, which actually a lot of Christians were just put to death. Mm-hmm. But John was exiled to Patmos, which was a penal colony in the Mediterranean Sea. It was just this little island just off the coast. So he wasn't far from Ephesus. He wasn't far from the people he was trying to write to, but he was on a penal colony that would make it much more difficult to be writing. And so he himself, as he's writing about the hope and the expectation and the things that they're experiencing, he's writing it himself from prison, basically. He is in prison on this island, so he's understanding this need for hope because of the persecution that they're facing.
Yeah, and so there's kind of 2, so that's kind of like what's going on in the culture, but there's kind of 2 dates that are proposed for the book of Revelation. The first would be during the Rome of Nero, between like 54 and 68 AD, and so we'll get to kind of like major, we might call like interpretive like camps or traditions, and tell you about the people who would kind of go for that and how it affects how they see the book of Revelation. And then the other view, which is probably like the more dominant view, is that it was written during the reign of Domitian. I think that's how you say that. Domitian. There we go. There's things that we don't know. AD 81 to 96. And so that's kind of like the more popular date. A really important thing that, again, we'll get to in a bit, that happened in 70 AD, and this is like really important for dating, is that it was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and the whole city of Jerusalem was sacked by the Romans. And so a lot of your dating comes down to whether or not you think that John knew about that, or John didn't know about that, or that was like a really huge thing in the Jewish culture, and that also meant that it was a big thing in the life of the Christians. So that would be a big thing when we come into the dating. There's a church father named Irenaeus, and he was he was alive during the 2nd century, and he connects Revelation to the reign of Domitian. That's Domitian. Yeah, that's how I keep wanting to say it. That's all good. So
neither of us excelled at our ancient languages studies. So.
No, I'm just terrible at sounding out names in general. Like, oh man, I think we talked about that on a previous podcast with Pastor Jay. So yeah, I'm terrible at that. So anyway, Irenaeus, he says that he thinks that it's that later period, and that's typically the view that's held. But some people would argue for that earlier dating during the reign of Nero. But what's important about the later dating is, this is a time, there was like definitely persecution that happened with Christians during Nero, but a lot of that was more so because Nero blamed the burning of Rome on the Christians, and so he kind of like just saw them as a scapegoat, where in the later periods there was starting to be a little bit more kind of like systematized persecution of Christians as they were, gaining more popularity and momentum, and becoming to be seen as more of a threat.
Yeah, and so that's important to realize as we're reading through this book, that the church is under great stress.
Yeah.
Whether you take it for the earlier date or the later date, there's already been the diaspora. There's already been the scattering of Jews across the known Roman world, and there's more to come in both situations. And with the scattering of the Jews, there's also been the scattering of Jewish Christians.
Yep.
And now then the influence of Gentile Greek philosophy and views playing into it. And there's heresies that are coming into the church through this. Through both the people wanting to uphold Jewish laws that have been done away with by Christ, and Greeks who are bringing in Greek philosophy, influencing Jewish thought and culture. And so a lot of these writings, the Gospels, the epistles, the letters, and the book of Revelation are speaking to a church that is young, is speaking to a church that is under persecution, that's under a lot of conflict, outwardly as they're being separated out into places all around the known world, and inwardly as people are bringing in thoughts and ideas that make them feel good but aren't really in line with the teachings of Christ to the disciples. And so that's where these writings come from, is the disciples are trying to set the story straight.
Yeah. And a lot of the persecution really comes down to worship. And you mentioned like the Imperial Cult, and all that means is just that in that time, and especially later, people were expected to pay tribute to the emperor, and they were actually expected to like worship the emperor as God. And the Christians weren't willing to do that. And that caused them a lot of grief. And even things like, being part of like trade guilds and things like that, like they were actually kind of persecuted and like ostracized in the society because they weren't willing to worship other gods, and it was a very polytheistic society. And so the dominant view in that day was like, the more gods, the merrier. So like, why wouldn't you be willing to just go and sacrifice to this god or that god? It was seen as very offensive to say that I believe that I serve the one and only true God, and I'm not going to worship anyone else. And so people called Christians atheists in the beginning because they were like, what do you mean you only believe in one God? Like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Like, like you're going to offend all these gods. And actually, as history would continue to go on, once Rome did fall, a lot of people blamed it on the fact that Rome had become Christian at that point, because they thought that it was because they abandoned all the pagan gods that they were like, being punished because they were not worshiping them. And so the worship of the gods is a really big issue, and we'll see that throughout Revelation. Yeah,
Paul addresses that in the book of Acts. He shows up and he's like, oh, I see you have an unknown God. He's like, let me tell you about the unknown God. So when we talk about this as apocalyptic literature, as prophetic literature, as an epistle, as letters, it comes to the question, and I think this is the one that you've all been wanting to hear. It's only taken us 40 minutes to get here.
Yeah.
Does the book of Revelation predict the future?
Ooh.
And I don't
That's a big
just
question.
mean John's future. Does it predict our future? And so there are 4 views on this, all right? And one of my favorite commentators, somebody that I've really enjoyed reading, his last name is Osborne. He says that it is both preterist and futurist. So there's your answer.
So what is that? What does preterist
What
mean?
does preterist and futurist mean? So let's
what kind of
actually go
fancy-
through the 4 types, and we're going to explain them here. So the first one is,
And so these would be kind of like the 4 interpretive camps, I guess, or the 4 ways of relating to this question.
Yes.
Does Revelation predict the future?
does Revelation predict the future? These are the 4 ways you can look at it.
And can I just jump in here? So I
Yeah.
just want to read chapter 1, verse 19, just to give you guys a little bit of the text and what it says. It says, therefore, write what you saw, what is, and what will be after these things. And so this is like a very major verse in the interpretation of Revelation, because it kind of lays out 3 time periods: what you saw in the past, what is, what's happening in the present, and what will be after these things. And so this, like a lot of the question about does Revelation even say that it's trying to predict the future, comes down to how you interpret this verse. And so I just want to set that up, and then I'll let you go.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks. And so this idea of historicist, that's the first type, historicist.
Ooh, historicist.
Historicist. You sound like a historian.
Yeah.
So historicism, it's a method of interpreting Christian eschatology or Christian view of the end of the world.
Yeah.
That's what eschatology means. It's just a big word that means the end of the world, the study of the end of the world.
Yeah. Eschatos is just last in Greek.
Yeah, see? Everything just comes back to Greek.
Yep.
And so this associates the biblical principles, biblical prophecies with actual historical events. So when you read a prophecy, the person is actually relating it to a specific event that has already taken place, something that we can, that they are now symbolizing with a historical person. So this has been implied a lot by people who read the book of Revelation. They see Babylon as Rome. They see the collapse of this comes to the later dating. They see the collapse of the Jewish temple, it being torn apart as having already happened. And so John is simply sharing what he has seen in very symbolic ways that are supposed to inspire and give hope to the people about the events that they have also witnessed, but is not necessarily telling them, it's not telling them about the future. It's just helping them understand the past. John uses symbolism so that he only stays in exile and doesn't get put to death. That's kind of the historicist view. It limits the symbols to specific historic events that have already taken place.
Yeah.
Even in John's life, he's already seen these things happen.
Yeah. And so people in this approach would go back into history and try to basically line up the book of Revelation with what has taken place in history. So, the fall of the Roman Empire, they'll even go to like the rise of the Muslim religion and all the wars that happened, the Crusades, things like that, the Protestant Reformation. They'll even say that things like Napoleon and Hitler were actually predicted by John. So all historical events have been predicted. So that's kind of like the historicist view. And really the big point is that it limits symbols to historic events, which means that anytime that we read something that's symbolic, so if we read about a dragon, they would say that it's not literally a dragon, but that symbol is referring to something that has happened in history.
Right.
And so that's the historicist position.
Yeah. And then there's preterist. And as I mentioned earlier, we tend to hold to like a preterist futurist type view. So preterists hold that ancient Israel finds its continuation or its fulfillment in the Christian church at the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD.
And so again, that's that thing that we were talking about that's really important for the dating of the book. It's also important for the interpretation that 70 AD is a good one to remember.
Yeah. And so the term preterism comes from the Latin praeter, which is a prefix denoting that something is past or beyond. So it sees the prophecies of the book of Revelation as events that happened in the 1st century AD. So it holds that there are a specific timeline, a specific bounding to the events of these books that finds its continuation or fulfillment within the Christian church. So it's kind of like a handoff from Judaism, the Old Testament, to Christianity, the New Testament, the age of the church. And a lot of it is focused around the destruction of Jerusalem, the fall of the temple in AD 70, which is also around the time that we really start to see even more Greek influence into Christianity, and it abound beyond the Jewish philosophies and interpretations that come with it being originally a strictly Jewish sect.
Yeah, and like this form of interpretation in its strictest sense would see every single thing that takes place in the book of Revelation as a past event that has happened. And that's like really important. So kind of like the two major forms is, one is that the entire book of Revelation is a prophecy that is looking forward to the fall of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD. And so everything that you read has already been fulfilled. Or another form of it would be that it's about more the fall of the Roman Empire in 5 AD, the 5th century AD. And so, again, it's this idea that the things that Revelation is prophesying about are now in the past when we look at it.
The third form that we want to talk about is idealist. Idealism, also called the spiritual approach or the allegorical approach, it's non-literal. It doesn't see the book of Revelation as having historical relevance or future relevance beyond symbolisms between the fight between good and evil. It's a symbolic portrayal of this conflict. This really plays into Gnostic belief, Gnostic structures of material versus spiritual, and which is, material being evil and spiritual being good, and that they're in conflict with each other, which is really against what Christ taught, what the epistles are telling us, what the early church believed, which is really that God created humanity and created the earth, created the material things and the spiritual things, and when it was done, he said it was good. So God doesn't say the material is evil. He says it's good. And so the problem with idealists is it's so symbolically based that it starts to lose its power. It starts to lose its impact. It starts to lose its influence because it's simply symbolic. It's a good word for your life, but it doesn't hold any power because it had no historical meaning and it has no future meaning. So it really has no present meaning. Which is really a struggle for this, because John clearly relates this to historical events and future events is what we hold.
Now, I will say that of all the approaches, I would most identify as an idealist. So
do you?
After you just bashed it. But hey, this is good because this is, again, getting into things where we may have slightly different views. And it's okay if we see things slightly differently, or if you see things differently. But I think the reason why I would say that I identify mostly as an idealist is just the sense that, I think that what you're saying, idealism can fall into the trap of thinking that, there's not an actual consummation. And so I think that John does kind of prophesy or talk about something that is actually going to happen in history. But at the same time, I think that a lot of the symbols that he uses shouldn't be limited to one historical event. And I think that's where a lot of people fall into traps, is when they try to limit the symbols and the things that he's talking about into one historic event. So that's kind of where I would not necessarily land, but I sympathize and I identify with this position, maybe more than I would the other ones.
So, and I hear you. And there are symbolisms that are definitely more symbolic than actual. And I think part of the problem that people who are in futurists, which I'm going to explain, or historicists especially, fall into is trying to figure out what those physical things are. Yeah. If you watched or read the Left Behind series, or Thief in the Night, or one of those series, or something like that, they would equate locusts to like Apache helicopters.
Yeah.
That's not a good idea. Like that's so limiting to a symbol that has so much more meaning to it. And we'll get to that, what those mean. Like the locusts do have a symbolic meaning in the Old Testament. And we kind of skipped over that. We're going to come back to that in a minute, the role of the Old Testament in this. And so you're right. There is something to be said about the symbolism in not trying to force it into being something very physical, very literal, that we currently understand, because it might not be that at all. Probably isn't that at all. But that's why I tend to fall more into the futurist camp, mixed. I'm like Osborne. I kind of mix the preterist and the futurist, because the futurism is a Christian eschatology view, a Christian view of the end of the world, that interprets portions of the book of Revelation, the book of Ezekiel, the book of Daniel as future events in a literal, physical, apocalyptic, and global context. So something is going to happen, something that's been prophesied. One of my Old Testament professors when I was in high school, he was an Old Testament professor. He focused really hard on prophecies. His dissertation was actually on Ecclesiastes and the role of Q in prophetic literature. And he talked about how prophecy had to have a meaning in the time of the author, a meaning in the time of Christ, and a meaning in the future of the church. And so I've really held to that prophecy kind of has to have that role of something in the time of the author, something in the time of Christ, and something in the time of Christ's return, the end of the world, the age of the church. And so that's kind of why I follow this preterist futurist. Because that's kind of my bias. That's how I've been raised, and that's how I kind of view biblical events and biblical text. So when we see this, then we see that chapters 4 to chapters 22 as predicting future events immediately preceding the end of the world. Now, this is where I struggle a little bit, because, and I hold to this preterist, is because I don't think the text is simply futurist. I also think that it has already taken place in the time of John, hence that prophecy is threefold. And that it also does play into idealism a bit, because there's a meaning for the church today, right? There's the past, the present, and the future role of
so
prophecy.
Like in the futurist approach, the things that John's writing, they wouldn't apply to Rome, because Rome has fallen and we haven't seen the climax of history. And so we're still waiting for all the things that John has written about from chapter 4 onward to take place. And so that would be kind of like, because when we're talking about this, it's really hard to like see the differences in these views. But that's a good way to think about like the distinction between more of a futurist or preterist or even historicist position, is like the things from chapter 4 on have not taken place. And there is kind of a little bit of a distinction. There's something called dispensationalism, or like dispensational futurism. And that would be that it's a very literal interpretation. It's kind of what you're saying. Like, this would be what a lot of people grew up with, I think, in the past, maybe like 50 years of the church, where it's like pre-tribulation, there's going to be a rapture. There's going to, like, the things that are written about, like the blood moons are literal blood moons. The locusts are like, well, there's probably not going to be locusts, so like they're Apache helicopters.
But then we did have a plague of locusts this year.
It's true.
In 2020.
Oh yeah, there's still locusts, but so they would try to see everything as literal, and something that's really important is that they see everything that happens as a chronological outline of how things are going to unfold. And so this is where you get into the pre-tribulation, that there's going to be a rapture, and then the church is going to be taken away before this great period of tribulation. And then there's going to be the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ, and then the final battle and all this stuff. And we're going to get into this more. When they see those 3 sets of 7, the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls, they would see those as each very independent things that are going to take place one after another. Whereas someone maybe like in an idealist position would see those maybe a little bit more as like, saying the same thing in different ways. So there is something called modified futurism, though, which is not as literal, and it doesn't view Revelation as necessarily that chronological map. So modified futurism would tend to not believe in kind of like the pre-tribulation rapture. And so maybe that's where you would fall.
Yeah,
I would say.
I am definitely a modified futurism
Yeah.
when it comes to that. And again, you have to remember, I kind of have a few leanings into a couple different areas. I'm not strictly one.
Yeah. Same with me, because I would
yeah.
say like I identify with that position
Yeah,
probably quite a bit.
I'm definitely not a dispensationalist. One of my high school teachers was a strict dispensationalist. And if you're not sure if you fall into this dispensationalism, if you've heard and you lean towards the use of the terms epochs and eras, it's taken from Daniel,
Okay.
from the Old Testament Daniel, but they break down the book of Revelation into epochs and eras. And this really helps them chronologically place the events that are going to take place. The problem with epochs and eras is they become so literal that, like, my high school teacher, he actually, not the Old Testament professor, a different high school teacher, he actually thought that either the U.S. government or the end of the world would happen in 2008, because by the way he lined up epochs and eras into groupings of 250 years, and the great nations, 7 great nations had come since the time of Rome, leading to the U.S. U.S. being the 7th complete great nation.
Yeah,
I know, I grew up in the States. That'll help you understand this. Right, that in his dispensational epochs and eras, it was coming to an end, 2008. It didn't. Here we are. And a lot of people debate on if the U.S. was really a great power at that point, but that was his interpretation of Revelation, because he was a dispensationalist and he saw the book of Revelation falling into these chronological events of epochs and eras that had very specific timelines.
Yeah, and this would be someone like Hal Lindsey, who's like a really famous person who predicted the end of the world in the 80s. He would be someone who would fall into that kind of dispensationalist mindset of there's a certain chronological sequence that things have to go through, and then the end will come.
I know a lot of people have read the book Harbinger.
Okay, I haven't heard of that one.
That one's really popular. That also falls into a dispensationalist type.
Yeah, it's like super popular, and there's an interesting history of how it got so popular, but we don't really have time to go into that.
Maybe on another podcast we'll come back to that.
Yeah,
we'll talk about the rapture.
So I think the other thing that we wanted to kind of touch on was just about how kind of the Old Testament is really baked into the fabric of this book.
Yeah,
and how important it is to understand.
That goes back to Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. And Daniel, you've been doing the reading here, so do you want to continue with that? Revelation chapter 1, verse 7?
Yeah, sure. So it says, "Look, he is returning with the clouds," and it's talking about Jesus here. "And every eye will see him, even those who pierced him, and all the tribes on the earth will mourn because of him. This will certainly come to pass. Amen." And then he says, "I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, the one who is and who was and who is still to come, the all-powerful."
And so this is critical, because when we read through these texts, as Christians, especially in North America, we tend to be a little weak on our Old Testament understanding. I've had a few people come and say, "Mike, I just can't read the Old Testament. It's too gory. There's too much wrath or too much anger." And I really struggle, and I understand the struggle.
Yeah.
But if you don't take time to understand the Old Testament as best as you can, then you're really going to miss out on what the New Testament authors are trying to say, because they are communicating from a worldview in which they have been deeply steeped in the Old Testament. They didn't have the New Testament. They were writing it. They were in the process of writing what we call the New Testament. What they had was the Old Testament. That was their old covenant. It was a covenant that they were born into. Old Testament literally means covenant. It comes from, it's the Latin for the Greek, for the Hebrew, meaning covenant. So 3 languages there. And so they're expressing how the old covenant has come to fruition in Jesus Christ and has established a new covenant, the New Testament.
He's the fulfillment.
He's the fulfillment. So if you don't take the time to understand the role of the Old Testament, then you really don't get what they're trying to communicate through the New Testament and how the old covenant has been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And so this is what's happening here in Revelation chapter 1, verse 7. John is directly referencing Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, which is part of this text that people see as apocalyptic literature in prophetic literature in the Old Testament.
Yep.
And Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10, again, another one that's seen as apocalyptic literature, prophetic literature, which both of them talk about the coming of the Son of Man. And this is why I tend to be a preterist and a futurist, because I see this first coming to fulfillment in Christ coming as an infant.
Yeah.
Not as literal as what people would expect, but this expectation of the Son of Man who is coming, and that all the nations of the world will mourn for him. But it talks about in... where is this here? Oh, yeah, in verse 7 here. And everyone will see him, even those who pierced him, right? So this has come about those who pierced him in the crucifixion, and then there's the resurrection. And then we have in the book of Acts the ascension, right? Christ going up into the clouds. And so there is this preterist, and then there's this futurist type part, which is Christ's return, which is every eye will see him, and he's returning on the clouds. But this ties in directly to Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, and Zechariah 12, verse 10. This language here, depending on the type of Bible you have, it will actually have it broken out, because these are literal quotes from those two passages. It's a blending together of them, but it's these two quotes that John has pulled from the Old Testament to help people see that the fulfillment of the Old Covenant has come through Jesus Christ and his new covenant.
Yeah, and so this is really important as we're talking and as we're reading and we're thinking about what the image is that John is seeing, is that he's going to borrow a lot of pictures and imagery, and he's going to kind of be living in the Old Testament in a lot of ways. And so you could read through the book of Revelation and not realize that all these things are almost like hyperlinks all over the place, that he's kind of saying like, hey, like you need to focus in on this word or this concept or this image, even if he's not directly quoting. Sometimes it's just the imagery that he's calling up. Like, you know, we talk about in the end of the book how there's this like stream that's coming out from the center of Jerusalem, and that is like a reference back to Eden, and it's a reference to Jesus. And so there's all this kind of imagery that's like hyperlinked through the Bible. And, you know, if you don't know the Old Testament, you're not going to really understand the point of why that symbol is there, because it's tied to that symbol, which is tied to a meaning in the Old Testament.
Yeah, and that one actually is tied directly to Ezekiel, which, again, like you said, refers to the Garden of Eden, and it has... We'll wait.
Yeah.
I love it. It's one of my favorite things to talk about, so we'll hold on.
Yeah.
There's some great stuff coming. So just join us as we go forward. But as we come to a wrap up on this first episode here, we have one more thing to discuss, and we've kind of hinted at it and bobbed around it a little bit throughout this episode, but we really want to get down to the crunch of the matter. Is what is the point of this book? So Pastor Daniel, what's the point of the book of Revelation?
Yeah, what is the point? So we've talked about how John is writing to the first century church, a little bit in that time period. And really it's this church that's facing persecution, and they're struggling with the question, like, why is this happening? We thought that Jesus established the kingdom of God, and yet all of this stuff is happening to us. And really, what he is trying to write that to them to say is to peel back the curtain, to say this is actually what's going on. And so, you know, God is still in control. God is still on the throne. God is working things out according to his plan. And one day he will, you know, fully overcome the forces of evil. So it's really this message of hope, and it's this message of, you know, that God is ultimately going to be the victor. He's just in the process of, you know, bringing things to completion. And really one of the big messages for the people is to call them to be faithful, and it's to call them to be the people of God in their situation, and to be the people who are faithful to God, even in the midst of their persecutions and their trials.
I think one thing that I really want to highlight as you read through the book of Revelation, and we encourage you as you go on this journey to read the book of Revelation, we're going to link some some tools that we use, some Bible studies we like.
Yep.
The Bible Project is a great one that we like to use, and some other stuff that's been very helpful for us as we've studied Revelation. But we invite you to read it. Like, don't just listen to us. Don't just read these other things. Actually read the book of Revelation. But one thing that I want to express that we need to be very careful about is that when we read books around the book of Revelation, especially novelized forms, or we watch movies, there seems to be Satan is winning, evil is winning, and then God is going to triumph as victor.
Yeah.
When you read the book of Revelation, Satan isn't winning anywhere in the book. Is he causing struggles? Yes. Is he causing persecution? Absolutely. But nowhere does it ever seem to put Satan and demonic forces as equal to God.
Yeah.
Sometimes equal to, like Michael, it talks about the archangel Michael being in conflict with Satan. But whenever God is on the scene or Satan is enacting his power, never once does it seem like Satan's power is triumphing and then God somehow overcomes.
Yeah. Yeah, we see that like in a couple of weeks. We're going to talk about Revelation chapters 4 and 5, which are really, that throne vision in chapter 4 where it is that God is on the throne and the Lamb is at his right hand.
Yeah. And so in our lives, I think it comes from this feeling of Satan is winning, we're struggling, and then God somehow overcomes. God has already overcome. There is no real struggle. And this is that struggle with the Gnostic viewpoint. Gnostics basically see, because it's spiritual, this almost equal tension between good and evil.
Yeah.
And a lot of current religions, where religions hold this idea of this equal balance between good and evil, the yin and the yang, the karma. That's not what Christianity is about. Christianity is about an all-powerful God that has allowed the freedom of man's will and the freedom of Satan's rebellion himself to enact upon the material world and on the spiritual world. But God is not equaled in power and in might. He's not the overcoming victor. He is just the victor. And so we need to keep that in mind as we read through this, that God's already won. There's no equal. He's just allowing things to play out in its time and in his time. And so that's really important as we look at this. Because I think so many times we come from God is somehow coming from behind. He's losing and somehow going to come up. No, God's not losing. God's not equalized in power to Satan. He is more powerful. He is in control. Yeah,
that's really good. I think that's a good place to end it for this week.
Yeah.
So just to give you a little preview of what's coming up next week. Next week, we're going to be looking a little closer at the structure of Revelation, how that can kind of speak to the meaning. And then we are going to be doing a deep dive on how we should understand all of these symbols, all of these, weird visions that are in the book of Revelation. How are we supposed to understand those? Are we supposed to understand those literally or figuratively? And how do we go about interpreting those? And so that's going to be
Mr. Idealist.
That's going to be a really important one. So Mike's making fun of me.
Yeah, that's going to have some great conversation. I can sense it already.
Yeah, it's going to be good. So we'll see you next Thursday.
See you next Thursday.
All right.